Good morning, guys. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and we're 2 weeks away. So just stay focused on that. Your test is 2 Fridays from now, May 15th at 1 p.m. And so I want to get you guys ready for that. And so here we go. Yes, I know I shaved. Get over it. So what I want to talk about today is period 3 and period 4. I'm going to start with period 3, but I don't want to go into great detail with the idea of the causes of the revolution. In the end, we've hit that quite a bit, actually. We just did it on the DBQ also. But I do want to touch on that. But what I really want to do and what I really want to focus on are the connections between these periods. And I hope you see that after you watch this. I want you guys to start thinking about that. How does the history connect together? And think of it in that pattern. Remember, history doesn't start and stop, start and stop, start and stop. It is interwoven. So you have to think in that regard. And you're ready to do so. So last 2 weeks there, focus on how do these periods connect to one another. 3 through 7, I'm going to start with 3. Okay, so when talking about the American Revolution, you can't ignore the importance of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War ultimately, in the end, is going to lead to the Revolutionary War, but it's not in the way that you think. So the 7 Years' War was happening between the French and the British, and they were fighting for basically the world power, world supremacy, and in the idea of who was going to take over more territories outside of their own mainland territories. America, obviously, North America, had the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard, the American colonies. These were English colonies, and the French also started to settle North America, but they settled around the Appalachian area, and they were big in fur trapping and trading. They were not there to, in a sense, colonize, but they were there to fur trap and trade. They weren't there to settle. You do see French, a number of them actually going and integrating into Native American tribes. And the reason being is they work together in the Appalachian area in fur trapping and trading. And you see the French kind of immerse into Native American culture and vice versa. But for the English, that was definitely not the case. The English looked at the Native American peoples as godless heathens. They called the woods the devil's playground. They were uncivilized beasts in the eyes of the English, and so there was a natural clash there for obvious reasons. And they're also fighting over the same resources, land, and what that land provided for Native Americans, but also what it provided for the English as they settled there. So the French and Indian War is between the French and a number of Native American tribes, and then a few Native American tribes who were the enemies of the many Native American tribes that were aligned with the French. And you also have the American colonists, but mainly the English forces. The English are going to have to send in their own military to defend the 13 colonies. The 13 colonies struggled to even come together to develop any type of unity. Matter of fact, Ben Franklin had an ingenious idea with the Albany Plan of Union to come together, raise money and funds to help fund a war to fight off the French and the many Native American forces that were trying to attack them. This fell flat on its face. Many of the colonists themselves did not see themselves as together. They were separate states, separate peoples with separate wants and desires. And so they couldn't even come together for that. So the English had to send in a lot of redcoats. And those redcoats are going to help defend the 13 colonies. In the end, the American forces were able to bring some type of unity, organized forces. And this is where William Pitt comes in to kind of push the Americans and the colonial forces to win this war. Now, this war was not a short war. It lasted from 1754 to 1763. And with that, the British government piles up a lot more debt. Yes, ultimately, in the end, they're able to chase the French out of North America. And now they have kind of the rightful path to North America, but it is also going to put them in further debt. And they're going to need the Americans' help and assistance in paying off this debt now, which we know the Americans are not going to be willing to do. So there are 5 main takeaways for the French and Indian War. The first being the fact that the Americans were able to assemble a militia force that actually ended up helping the British defeat the French Native American forces and successfully defend the 13 colonies. Those same men will later become the Minutemen and training the Minutemen who will take on the English in the Revolutionary War of 1776. But what we also see too is the Albany Plan of Union. And yes, I get it. It was voted down, but it's the roadmap to our future Congress. It's exactly what we will set up and what we're going to become. So for many, this just makes perfect sense, the fit there. And it takes a while for the Americans to come together for the revolutionary cause, but there's no doubt the Albany Plan of Union was the groundwork. And we also see 3, the heavy presence of redcoats that come to North America to help the American colonists defend the colonies, but they don't leave, they stay. And the reason why they're going to stay is they're needed for something. They're needed to collect taxes from Americans now, which is the 4th thing. The British go into debt. The Americans need to pay these taxes. They have redcoats and the presence around to make sure that they are collecting and paying these taxes, to enforce these taxes, especially around the Boston area. And this obviously is going to become the spark to the powder keg of the Revolutionary War, the Boston area. And the 5th one is the reluctance of the Americans to pay those taxes. We know this has been done before. In the 1600s, the British tried to collect taxes from the Americans, and the Americans began to smuggle and protest Governor Andros and his policies of tax collecting. It wasn't a long period. It was 2 years, but ultimately we do see how this is going to play out again, and it does almost to a T. So big takeaways there: French and Indian War, how it becomes, in a sense, the prelude to the American Revolution. The next thing I want to talk about is government, and how the Americans formed this new government and the roles and steps that it took to actually get there. In the formation of our new government, it's impossible to not think of what the Revolutionary War or the British did to the Americans that ended up shaping American policy and government. Think about it this way: it's kind of like a bad relationship. It scars the American people, and they're going to do things and create things that try to heal those wounds. And I'll give you an example. As the Americans begin to develop their own government, the thing that they want to make sure of is that they don't give too much power to a federally run portion of the government. They're afraid of another king. They're afraid of another, British Parliament, someone who has power over them, exacting this influence, and the American people themselves being the ones who are, suffering because of this tyrannical government. So they set up what was known as our first form of government, was the Articles of Confederation. And it set out to do exactly what I said. It was a weak form of federal government. Matter of fact, it was completely ineffective. Ultimately, in the end, you see it fail in Shays' Rebellion. I'll get to that in a second. But just to give you ideas of there was no real power in the federal government. They didn't have power over the states. The states truly held the power in the cards. So there was really no unity either. No federal funds to raise, although they didn't feel they needed them. The states themselves set out to set the course for the people. This land was vast. The people were different. And they felt that the best way to govern is just to let the people in the states choose what's best in the end. And this will feed in later to things like state sovereignty and rights in our new form of government, the Constitution. But the Articles of Confederation, too, needed 9 out of the 13 colonies to approve any type of bill, legislation, which, guys, to get 9 of the 13 of those colonies to agree on anything would be nearly impossible. So just see that this is just a completely ineffective government, and it fails, or the signs of its failures in Shays' rebellion. Daniel Shay was an ex-revolutionary patriot, and he and others were upset that they had to pay taxes where, again, you saw state officials, but they felt that they were also risking their own lives for the cause of revolution. Therefore, they should not have to pay taxes that were building up from then. And so he and his boys get some guns and they march into the Boston area and they start to terrorize it. It almost works. It's almost successful, this revolution. They almost overthrow the Massachusetts government. However, it is George Washington who is able to assemble forces to make sure that this rebellion is stricken down. But what it did show George Washington, and it did show other politicians at the time and our founding fathers, is that this government, the Articles of Confederation, is too weak. It doesn't allow us to build an army and raise federal funds. And that army is not going to be used to defend us against the British again or any other invaders. It's going to be used to defend us against ourselves. There was too much trust that was put into the American people. Therefore, this new form of government had to put more power in the hands of the federal government and less power in the hands of the state governments, hence the Constitution of the United States of America, which again is ratified in 1789. Now, the Constitution has still many qualities and traits of the fear of a king. The Bill of Rights shows that. The Bill of Rights, when you think of freedom of speech, freedom of thought, but the Second Amendment to the right to bear arms is to protect us against a tyrannical government if it ever happened. The Third Amendment is the idea of the non-quartering of troops, that the federal government can't quarter troops in your house like the Quartering Act did. The Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, same thing. British soldiers coming in your house, searching your belongings without having really the right to do so. This is where you start to see all these amendments and parts of our government protect the citizens from their own federal government. So states' rights were going to be a thing. Anything that the federal government did not put into the Constitution was power to the states and the people, and that again enforced those rights. So there is a major fight that is going to rage over this new form of government known as the Constitution as they're trying to ratify it. And this process is not going to be an easy one. It's going to take 2 years before they really come to terms on what this new form of government is going to look like. The Anti-Federalists and the Federalists are going to lead in this debate, and the Federalists, for obvious reasons, are going to want a stronger federal government. The Anti-Federalists, obvious name, obvious reasons, want a weaker federal government. And it's going to come down to what the Federalists need, and they need to have enough power to collect on tariffs that will strengthen a military force that could stop revolutions in the future. And this will happen. There's no doubt about that. And we'll also see that the Daniel Shays of the past are no longer going to even make a threat against this new form of government, as it's going to prove itself. But the federal power is going to be one that does ultimately have the power over the states and the people. Now, that doesn't mean that this is going to be debated. Matter of fact, the only thing that the Civil War truly settled was the fact that the federal government did have power over the states and the people. But that debate continued to rage on for the next 100 years after this Constitution is ratified. I mean, people really were testing it. The different branches of government were tested. You had 3 branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial. No one really knew what the judicial branch held its power. And that's the shaping of all this. And obviously that's done by like John Marshall, the Chief Justice in the Marshall Court, which is going to strengthen the power of the Supreme Court to make decisions, especially when in regards to states versus states, or states versus the federal government, or people versus state, or people versus the federal government. It made sure that they were the ones who were doing the judicial review of the Constitution and ruling whether or not a law was constitutional or unconstitutional. But we see it in a sense, this balance of power that's created in the separation of powers between these three branches. And that's the guarantee that neither branch became too powerful that it dominated the other two. So you have a checks and balance system. So our government, the Constitution, it is the scars from that bad relationship between us and the British. It is so evident. But as we start to move forward, it is definitely the Federalists that start to dominate, in a sense, government, eventually leading to what we know even today as the American Empire. And what I mean by that are its ideas. I mean, think about this, guys. It was Hamilton who was going to push the idea of expansion. And it is going to be an anti-federalist president that is going to do that expansion in a guy who railed against it. But what America has is, in a sense, the potential to become an empire. And it is going to start to really come to fruition throughout the 1800s. But what I want you guys to start to consider is this new form of government and how it was effective. And one way that it was going to be tested was in the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion was led by a lot of people in Appalachia. And guys, you have to realize people in Appalachia are even lawless in many regards to this day. A lot of Scots-Irishmen there. And they're not in agreement with the lawman, and especially in the idea of paying taxes that they feel are unfair and unjust to specifically them. And so they begin to fight back. Obviously, production of whiskey in this area is quite high. And so their fight is going to be one that is aimed at the federal government. Well, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton marched soldiers into Appalachia. And when they finally get there, as word begins to spread that they're coming, many of those Appalachian people who are trying to stage this rebellion decide just to take their squirrel hunting rifles and go home. They know that they're no match for this new power, the federal army. And that shows that the federal government did exactly, the Constitution did exactly what it set out to do, which was to protect ourselves from ourselves. And that is how the Constitution, in one way, in one regards, proves itself. But obviously, the things I talked about before, the balance of power, all those things. This shows you how the times of our past, our relationship with the British, impacts what we become. And that's what I really want you to think about, guys, are those connections. Keep making those connections from period to period. Tomorrow, again, I'm going to be doing period 4, and I'm going to link it from period 3 to period 5, right? How 4, in a sense, is influenced and influences the next. So it's important to see those connections. That's what you're going to have to do for this test. So just keep that in mind as you continue these last couple of weeks of review. We'll see you tomorrow.